So welcome everybody, whether you're a CE member or not. My name's Barbara, I'm CED Secretary, and I'm hosting the meeting this evening in place of Angus Armstrong, who's the one who's put together this series of tech talks for us and is unable to be with us this evening though. This is the penultimate talk of this 21-22 series of talks. So we have Alan talking to us next month. Alan Chadbourne was talking about sanitation. We look forward to that. Then we'll have a short break of a few months, and hopefully we'll be back with a new series in the autumn. And of course, particularly welcome to Rob, who's going to talk to us this evening on CED and climate change. And hopefully there'll be plenty of time at the end to hear your views, because that's what we really want to hear at the end. So, Rob, over to you.
Right, well, I'll share my screen. CED and climate change. Welcome to this topic. I need to say at the outset that I have no special training and qualifications to talk about this. I've read a few books. The idea is that we will stimulate a bit of discussion on the issues around climate change and how CED is affected by it. I've just got a picture of a typical CED project that happens to be Pawaga back in 2012 in Tanzania. The summary of what I want to do in the next few minutes is give you a brief introduction, then introduce my own involvement in climate change, run through how CED and climate change has developed up to now, and then just highlight a dilemma that we have, that no development is possible without carbon emissions. I want to introduce some challenging questions which will provoke discussion, I hope. I want to run quickly through the CED environment policy that has been agreed by the board a couple of years ago. I want to say a few things, especially about concrete, because that's a sort of case study. I want to talk about a strategy for the future, and then I want to introduce a few books and websites as reference material before we launch into our discussion. So, introduction. This is, I'm not going to give you a lot of graphs. In fact, I think this is the one of two that I've picked out from the internet. And this one just illustrates how carbon emissions have followed the growth of human population over the last few centuries, remarkably correlating the two lines. Carbon emissions in black and the human population in blue. And it's been possible to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the 1950s fairly accurately, and it's gone up from about 315 parts per million to about 410 a few years ago, mostly due to burning fossil fuels. And it is possible, I understand, to measure very approximately the level of carbon dioxide in your home, but I haven't got around to trying to do that. This is an interesting graph that I found on the internet, which shows that carbon dioxide levels in parts per million have been fluctuating over the last 800,000 years, apparently. I don't know how they arrived at this information, but then since 1950, up to the current level is rather different. So that's just an interesting background graph. So my story, this is how I got involved. I'm not going to go through the top half of the story at all. I have always felt that the world is unfair, and you can see all the different organizations I've been involved in throughout my life. Just to mention the lifestyle movement's motto, live more simply so that all may simply live, which has been a sort of backdrop to my life in some ways. But the bottom half of the screen is more to do with the last 3 years when I got involved in Christian climate action, inspired mostly by my son, Sam, who was on the front line of Extinction Rebellion and Christian climate action. At the same time, I was inspired to join Green Christian, which is an organization mostly meeting online, of course, over the last couple of years, and going through a course called Radical Presence, which is a Christian approach to responding to climate emergency. I got involved in a Tier Fund group locally studying Ruth Valerio's book, Saying Yes to Life, which I'll come back to. I tried to persuade our church to get involved in eco-church, reducing their carbon footprint, but I'm afraid I've not succeeded in that yet. I'm still hoping that I can persuade the church to adopt that and get involved. But what I have done is I've written in the CED newsletter, and you might have seen that. So, CED and climate change, I think there are good reasons why Christian engineers in development should understand and be involved in these issues, because as Christians, we love our global neighbors, we care for God's creation. As engineers, we understand the technical background about global warming and carbon emissions and the effect on human population and other species. And as people in development, we understand and sympathize with the world's poorest communities, who contribute the least and suffer the most. So we put those three together. We are Christian engineers in development. We engage, we understand and respond. It all makes sense to me. So the story so far, renewable energy has been part of what CED has done for a very long time. Hydropower has featured in our work for many years, so it's not entirely new. Solar we have not touched on so much, but it's still something we've thought about and could get involved in the future. I mentioned the articles in the newsletter, and I've mentioned the environment policy. And of course, over the last couple of years, we've reduced our travel, mostly due to the pandemic more than to respond to climate change. But one way or another, board meetings, regional meetings, tech talks like this have all been on Zoom. And individuals, of course, attended by video links before 2020. And future meetings are usually going to be online, but not always. We still want the AGM to be in person, although it is possible to have an open meeting online as well as an in-person annual open day. And then, of course, avoiding unnecessary flights is something we'll come back to. Time for another picture. This is just a picture of a Pelton wheel, which is actually the old one that needs to be replaced in the Luamba Hospital in the remote part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the project I'm involved in at the moment. The CED newsletter articles over the last few years, there were 2 articles by me in 2019 and 2020, and then 2 in which Barbara has compiled information about climate change in Tanzania and Sierra Leone from the Climate Links website, which we'll come back to. Just as a sample of one of those, I just quickly did a little extract of, I'm not going to read this through. You can look at the old newsletter if you want to get this information, or you can look at the Climate Links website. But that just gives you a flavor of the sort of things that are happening in Tanzania as a result of climate change. And our CED dilemma is that all our work contributes to our carbon footprint. Long-haul flights, fossil fuels, concrete are all heavy contributors to global warming. But other aspects of our lives also need to change. And one of the things that we are doing is video calls, which are very helpful. We can meet our partners overseas face to face, and we could use more, I think, if our partners at the other end are equipped, of course, with the necessary equipment. There are some that are, some that are not. So the challenging questions that I'm going to come back to at the end: do we agree on the causes? Are we aware of the consequences? Should CED take appropriate action? So far, the board has answered yes to all those three questions. But what about the personal ones? Are we contributing to this crisis? Should we reduce our carbon emissions? Should we act as individuals and as an organization? And should we consult CED members? And underlying all those questions is the one in red at the bottom: how easy is it to talk about the climate emergency? I don't know whether you can see these things that I'm just getting rid of here. So, coming to the CED Environment Policy of November 2020, it assumes that creation belongs to God, that believers should act as good stewards and serve without compromising future generations. CED recognizes that global warming is caused by human activity, carbon emissions must be reduced urgently, and vulnerable suffer more but emit less carbon, and development adds emissions. How to reduce the impact, question before travel, and project proposals assessed. So this is all things that I've already touched on, but this is part of the policy as agreed. Members are encouraged to feedback after CED brings environmental matters to members, and which is what we're doing at this very moment. Projects, climate change affects concept sustainability. We've talked about reducing visits. We've talked about reducing local transport costs, and we've talked about reducing concrete. We could source materials locally. We could introduce a positive impact such as tree planting, and we could introduce community training, but we want to avoid lecturing people facing extreme poverty from our comfortable and secure vantage point. So that's a tricky one, really. Offsetting emissions is also a complicated issue because, as I see it, funds that have been given to CED for a specific purpose transferred to another organization which is also doing good work, but is specifically trying to follow up on offsetting emissions, such as carbon stewards. I mean, that's really transferring money that's been given to CED for a purpose to another organization, which, although doing good work, is actually using it for a different purpose. So I'm not sure whether that's okay. We refer to the environmental assessment summary, which Tearfund introduced, and it is to be found on the micronetwork.org website. And then, as part of the policy, we have just listed renewable energy, mini hydro, and solar power as potential projects. And homing in on UK travel, executive meetings, video conferencing, attending virtually. I've already mentioned AGM open days should not always be a virtual event, and other meetings can be via video conferencing. Overseas travel, is the visit necessary? I'm sorry if this is becoming a bit repetitive. What will it achieve? Could a video or phone call be used instead? And when flights are necessary, could the visit be combined with another one nearby? When is the best time and when is the best route? Indirect flights are sometimes cheaper, but involve more emissions. So when it comes to in-country travel, we want to minimize it, making the most of the time. And we want to assess the cost benefits of public transport over partners' vehicles, bearing in mind the increased risk in public transport in some countries. And then, of course, we want to monitor, we minimize environmental impact and monitor annually. So that's the environment policy that was agreed. And there's just a picture of some tree planting in Tanzania. So now I want to come to the issue of concrete. Concrete production is very carbon heavy. And why is that? Cement has to be heated to a very high temperature in order for clinker to form. And I understand this is because one of the constituents is tricalcium silicate in concrete, which cures within hours of pouring and is responsible for much of its initial strength. I'm not a concrete specialist, so I know there are people on this call who know much more about this than I do, but I understand that the cement industry contributes 2.8 billion tons of CO2 every year, more than any country other than China and the US, and between 4 and 8% of all global man-made carbon emissions. So the Institution of Structural Engineers has come up with some research. They've suggested that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will require a huge increase in the use of alternative cements and a shift away from Portland GGBS, ground granulated blast furnace slag, and fly ash or pulverized fuel ash, and also lowering the overall demand for cement. New materials to substitute for cement are currently have limited production capacity compared to the vast quantities required. So it is important that we educate ourselves, be prepared to incorporate alternative cements into the designs as they become available, help create a market for and build acceptance of alternative cement products. And then to sum all that up, the future cement industry could conceivably develop a wide range of cements based on locally available, highly abundant, low carbon, natural resources with massive reductions in embodied carbon as a result. And that's as far as I know about the subject. And again, I'm sure there are people on this call who know more about this than I do. So there's just a picture of the filters at Pawaga, which is one use of concrete in a CED project. So we come to strategy, reducing CED carbon footprint, and you'll see there are a few question marks there. Minimizing travel, changing materials used in construction as and when possible. Designing for extreme events, I have not thought that one through, but I've just put it down there as a possible strategy. Considering personal carbon footprints, and then considering our influence beyond CED, which is an interesting possibility. And one thing we have not got around to doing yet is developing targets. It's possible that we could try and work out the carbon footprint of CED as an organization and then set ourselves a target to achieve, but we have not done that yet. So some references. This is a good website, Climate Stewards, provides tools for measuring carbon footprints, the very thing that I was just mentioning, for individuals as well as for organizations, and they also provide some proposals for taking action, etc. Another website that I've already referred to, Climate Links, which is hosted by USAID. It's a global knowledge portal for climate and development practitioners and includes resources, photos, blog, projects, and events. Now, one of the source books that has inspired me on this subject is this one, There is No Planet B. This is not a Christian book. This is a secular book by Mike Berners-Lee, who is a professor at Lancaster University, and he's a researcher and writer on carbon footprinting and also involved in a local organization. And just to give you a flavor of what that book contains, these are the chapter headings. I'll leave you to read through those because you'll see that there's a wide variety of different topics involved in thinking about climate change. And I'm particularly interested in the two in green at the bottom: values, truth, and trust, and thinking skills for today's world. So you can see he's thinking very widely there, everything from food to technology and everything in between. Coming to a Christian book, which I already mentioned, Saying Yes to Life by Ruth Valerio. She's the Tear Fund Global Advocacy and Influencing Director, and this book was actually the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book for 2020. Now, to give you a flavor of that, I've got some Bible verses. Now, each of the chapters in her book refer to a day in the creation story. So the 6 days and 6 chapters, 7 days actually, sorry. And she tries to bring together creation and redemption. So these are some well-known verses which you'll recognize. Colossians 1, to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, the one through whom and for whom and in whom all things were created. And Psalm 69, do not let the flood waters engulf me, or the depths swallow me up. The Lord hears the needy and does not despise his captive people. And then on each of these days, different things were created. The first day was light, and then there was water, and then there was trees. God created trees and then sent his son to die on a wooden cross. 2 Peter 3, you ought to live holy and godly lives as you look to the day of God and speed its coming. So that's where you're looking to the future. And then in Exodus 3, I have seen the misery of my people. I've heard them crying out, I'm concerned, and I have come down to rescue them. And then going back to the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, to sum it all up, humanity was created on the same day as all the other land creatures. So we are bound up with the rest of creation as one of the creatures. Another book that has inspired me is this one. It's the summary of Christian climate action. It's got 39 short chapters, and one of them was actually written by my son, Sam. So you turn to chapter 30 and you'll see what he says. Before that was published was this secular book by Extinction Rebellion themselves, with some well-known authors that you'll recognize: Caroline Lucas MP, Rowan Williams, Kate Raworth, the economist, who's famous for her donut economics, and then some chapters by Indigenous community representatives. So they're not all well-known people, but others in this book describe their feelings and experiences as activists, and there's also some campaign strategies. So that was published back in June 2019 when Extinction Rebellion was all the news. Then I want to mention one book which is quite different from the others. It's about racism, race, privilege, and the struggle for climate justice. This may surprise you, and it may sound more controversial, but I want to give you a flavor of what it's about. In this book, Jeremy Williams describes 3 kinds of racism, mostly unintentional. There's individual, institutional, and structural or systemic racism. And climate change is of the 3rd kind. Structural racism is the scaffolding of policies, institutions, cultures, and norms that perpetuate and reinforce racial inequality. So he claims in this book that weak climate targets are racist policies, and climate change is a civil rights issue. And to give you that quote at the bottom really explains a little bit about his thinking on this subject. If it's true that climate change is predominantly caused by white people and disproportionately suffered by people of color, then we are in the early stages of an epic racial atrocity, one that will echo through the world history for centuries to come. Now, you may think that's a bit controversial. I just throw it in there as a possible topic for discussion, but we won't focus on that too much. So coming back to the general challenging questions, do we as CED members and friends agree that climate change and global warming are caused by human activity? Many in my church do not agree. Many in the engineering profession do not agree. Do we agree? Are we aware that the developing world, including countries where we work, is already suffering the consequences of global warming and ecological destruction? There is evidence. If we find out more, we can educate ourselves. If we contact our overseas partners, they will be able to tell us more. And should CED as an organization take appropriate action in response to the climate emergency, agreeing that it is an emergency? So far, the board have said yes. What do the membership think? This is a chance to find out. And then coming to the personal questions. Do we agree that our way of life is, as well as our work with CED, is contributing to this crisis and emergency? The board has been reluctant to ask CED members to act personally or to change their way of life. So personal suggestions were actually omitted from the policy that was agreed, and you might have noticed that as I went through it. But here is the question. Do CED members agree that we need to change, that we need to reduce our carbon emissions? And should we all take action as individuals to cut our personal carbon emissions alongside actions that we are taking as an organization? And should CED members be consulted more about issues like this? And if so, how? And that's the last slide. Let's talk about the climate emergency. I hope I've given you enough to stimulate some discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rob. You've certainly given us plenty to think about. So I just invite you to unmute yourselves now and let's have your thoughts. If anyone has immediate thoughts they'd like to share them, please do. Otherwise, we can take the questions that Rob has posed one at a time. Well, obviously, if anyone has direct questions for Rob, then please let us know. Nigel.
Thanks, Rob, for that engaging presentation, actually. Certainly from my own point of view, I agree with all of the 1, 2, 3 suggestions and about climate change and human impact, etc. I just thinking about the CED impact, if we're doing a hydro scheme or we're doing another, say, a water scheme or whatever, whilst there are some climate emissions as a result of concrete and what we incorporate into that scheme, hopefully on an ongoing basis, that will reduce, possibly significantly reduce carbon impact in terms of its running over the years that come about after that. You know, I researched how many trees were burnt to boil water for drinking purposes, and 2.3 billion people in the world boil water for drinking. You just think how many trees that accounts for if you're doing that day after day after day. If you put a clean water scheme in, and that then, if you can basically provide it in a way that they have confidence in the quality of the water, that could reduce the impact of that, you know, for years and years, you know. So hopefully the balance is in that favour, really. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm David, and I've done 2 solar projects in South Sudan, and I'm working on a 3rd. The problem is they're not ready yet to maintain it and that has been where we've had so much pain. We've tried to eliminate diesel And to go with solar, they've got plenty of that, but it's that next step where they carefully don't discharging the batteries down to nothing before they put some new diesel in the tank. The machine calls, send me, switch on the diesel generator, but it doesn't happen because no one has filled up the tank. And it's that one that is heartbreaking after all our efforts to design the equipment, take it there, install it, and then the people are just not capable of looking after it. And it's cost us a lot of money and effort. And so that's the discouragement we've had in South Sudan.
Mm.
David, how much education goes with alongside your solar installations?
We try to educate the persons who were there at the time. In both cases, those persons have moved on, either because of political disruptions or they've been promoted or taken somewhere else. And that's then when it falls down. So first plant was 2012, the next one 2016, and we're hoping to do the one we're working on now in 2023.
Mm.
Let's go to Steve Pryor now, and then maybe if anyone has got anything anything helpful that they might like to say to David on the point that he's raised, then please come back to that. Let's go to Steve first.
I just wanted to reinforce that that comment because it's very pertinent to me, because I've been trying to improve the power supplies at our sites in South Sudan as well as other places for Tearfund for the 5 years that I've been working for Tearfund, and I am literally right now in the process of pitching for $500,000. That's the extent of the cost to get high quality, robust solar systems that are big enough to replace the generators, that will have suitable control and monitoring facilities, because of exactly the problem described. That, you know, the people there, and these are our staff, and we tell them what the issue is, and we, you know, I don't know how many times I've said to people, you cannot discharge the batteries all the way, and yet it just happens over and over and over again. And there's a tendency to not buy big enough systems. There's a tendency to buy very poor quality systems, and it just kills them. And of course, the waste, the environmental damage done by the waste is considerable. But we shouldn't underestimate the challenge. As I say, I'm looking at nine sites, I think it is, one of which is big in Juba. But the solar power supplier, who do seem to know what they're talking about, is giving us quotes which it looks like we're going to need $500,000. And even that, the question of have people given money for this is one that will come up. Can we find that money? You know, should we be doing other things with it? But even you know, this is a double-edged thing. It's not just an environmental question. It's a reliability of power supplies for our field sites and our operations. But that's considerably more money up front than a diesel generator, which they will still want anyway. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of back that point up.
Thank you, Steve. It's interesting, isn't it? It's often not the technology itself that is the issue. Yeah.
And I'd reinforce it from another sunny country. In Pakistan, these are commercial projects that I was involved in, but panels were fine. It's the inverters, they're too complicated. If they go wrong, somebody has to come along with a computer and reset them. And the battery technology, I could never get my head around. There's liquid lead acid, there's gels, there's deep cycles. We tried all of them, and they all last about 2 years and cost a fortune to replace. And mission hospitals and all that we worked with, they just lost interest in it, because great getting capital funding to get it all in, but when you have to go and ask for more money for batteries after 2 years, locals just tend to use truck batteries, and they know they're going to have to replace them. But I was not enamored with this whole solar thing. Some villagers just rely on it during the day. Why try to store the electricity, because it's just costs far too much. So to me, there's some way to go yet before solar is useful as in these countries. I don't know why, everybody loves it here, but I think it's connected to the internet. So when most people aren't storing it, they're selling it back to the grid. And it's very different business when you try to store the power. We looked at pump storage schemes and all sorts of things, but that doesn't seem to get pushed by solar people. They just want batteries. But I know I've seen being done. Why can't you just build a lift shaft and have the weights go up and then come down at night? All sorts of ideas are kicked around, but no, it's batteries, and they're a real problem. So sorry, Rob.
Sounds like we've got a bit more work to do.
I mean, while I'm on, can I carry on with a couple of other points then?
Please do.
Yeah, firstly, you started off with that graph of population versus carbon emissions, which surprised me, because I thought the whole issue was that we're generating far more emissions now than we're used to per capita. So that graph made me happy. Well, let's reduce the population of the world and that will solve the problem. So there's something wrong with that graph.
Yeah, there's something wrong. I agree.
There's got to be something not linked. Well, linked, but with a greater growth. And the other one is with CED. If the climate emergency is so great and CED is helping contribute to the problem, just close CED down. Well, it comes over so strongly that it's a real problem, but nobody says, well, if it's such a problem, you'd abandon ship. But we don't tend to do that. We're going to carry on. Are we going to carry on? I mean, as a boy, I can remember people talking about pollution. The world's going to end tomorrow because all the rivers were being polluted and this, that, and the other. And eventually, environmental legislation came in, and all that seems to be not quite fully solved, but certainly it's not such an issue as it was in the 60s. And so and I know there's ways to go yet, but will engineers solve this by carbon capture and pumping things back into the ground or whatever? Is that something we hope for in order to carry on developing now, or do you want to stop developing now because it is a real emergency and wait till the technology catches up and then start again?
I think the answer is that we want to carry on, but we want to modify the way we work.
Okay, so with the CED comments, I don't know, I remember a year or two ago, you or Barbara or somebody writing to me, asking me about concrete and things. So I don't know if anybody's done an analysis of actually how much concrete is used in CED projects, but you seem to have honed in on it a bit. But at that time, I mentioned there are other ways to build. Before concrete came along, there were bricks. You can have sun-dried bricks. You can have fired bricks, which have carbon. Yeah. You can have bricks which are unreinforced. You can do pocket wall bricks with bars down the middle, so you don't have concrete, you don't need shuttering. You might need to plaster it, still needs cement. I don't know, there's 101 ways to reduce the amount of cement in CED projects, but it does depend on which country you're in, whether you've got bricks or other alternatives, which is what I'd said at the time. So I'm not sure you can have a policy unless the policy says that we're going to look at individual cases individually, rather than saying we have to do X, Y, and Z.
No, I agree. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and I think one of the other issues is that overall in our projects, how much concrete are we actually using anyway? And if you look at that compared to what we hope is the benefit that those projects bring, are we wasting our time even thinking about it? I suppose I feel we need to keep abreast of what's going on. So we need to understand what new products might be available, or as you say, Colin, what old products we should perhaps return to. But certainly not stop what we're doing. I mean, those people that we're trying to help, I mean, how could we say to them, oh, you know, sorry, we're trying to reduce carbon emissions. We decided not to go ahead with your water supply. I mean, it just doesn't make sense, does it? And I think this is one of my problems, that I feel it is that climate change is a very important subject, and we do need to, you know, as individuals, we need to act. But as CED, there is a limit to what we can do.
Yeah, I would agree, because compared with my type of engineering, which is structural engineering, I probably use more concrete in a floor slab than CED does in a year altogether. You know, it does seem a bit out of proportion what's trying to happen, unless CED goes into doing bridges and other type of work. But if it's mainly water related, then even the micro hydro and all that's done, the dams and all are very small, and they certainly can be looked at, whether you use concrete or not, depending on the country. Yeah.
I suppose in my project in Tanzania on the Pawaga water supply, there was a lot of concrete. We were building tanks out of concrete blocks. We were building treatment works. I showed you a picture of the filters there, and there was quite a lot of concrete involved, one way or another.
It's still not as much as compared with a building. I've seen the pictures of it. A 5 or 6 story building probably has foundations with the same amount of concrete as you have.
Rob Brickhouse has put a comment in the chat. I think you probably realise he's on a train, so he doesn't want to unmute himself. He has made a couple of comments. So the last one saying, I agree with Colin. I think the focus on concrete use is very secondary to the need for us as Christians to focus on our personal carbon footprints and to be active socially and politically to address the wider problem, particularly in our Western culture.
Good, Rob. Glad to hear that.
It's a bit unfortunate Angus has gone skiing then, isn't it?
Yeah, that's probably why that's not on the call.
I also like Rob's comment that There Is No Planet B is an exceptionally good book and encourages people to read it.
Absolutely, I think it's a brilliant book, and those chapters that you put in green at the end, that's the ones about truth. Well worth reading. Yeah, he also talks about the sort of.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, certainly. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking that as CED, we have influence about decisions made within the projects, and those decisions are wider than just the particular project. So exploring, like we're just talking about concrete, sorry to go back to concrete, if we start saying we want to examine alternatives and use them where possible, we're influencing. It's not just the physical project we're involved in, we're also influencing. And there is the principle that of every small bit that we do becomes something big. So if everybody is doing their small bit, so while our involvement in CED's involvement in concrete per se is quite small, it would be significant if everybody was doing it. Well, when I was in Kenya, I was making water tanks, and I always used 50% lime in the build of water tanks, because lime has certain qualities and over time it actually, I think, creates a stronger structure for water tanks. And lime is made at a lower temperature than concrete. Isn't that true? And some of the oldest buildings in Kenya are lime buildings, you know, the Gedi ruins, the old Arabic settlements. So, you know, that might be one thing that CED could say. We'll always use lime if you feel that's appropriate in our construction. And you're just, it's an incremental change, but it's an important change, isn't it? Well, I think we have influence, not only in concrete, but in solar, in hydro, in other ways. I just wanted to make that comment.
All right.
Thank you.
Does anyone have experience of using lime in their construction work?
Don't think so.
Well, in building work, yes, lots of it, because it's what was used in the mortar for brickwork originally. So to use it again, it's still used, because if you're doing historic buildings, you want to use lime. Lime is nowhere near as strong as cement, but it is more flexible. It also exhibits something called autogeneous healing, so that when it gets wet, if it cracks, the lime leaches into the crack and fixes it, which takes longer with a harder cement. Cement is more brittle, though it's stronger. So yes, there are ways still of using lime. I've never heard of it being mixed in with pure cement with concrete as a lime. There are other products which are mixed in with cement, which I was surprised to see on Rob's list of don't go there anymore, because for years we've been told to go there, and that's the use of GGBS, because that is cheaper. It's a byproduct of another industry, and you're saving cement, and same with PFA.
Yep.
So as I've left Pakistan, I left with a project there where against the climate thing, there's an oil-fired power station I was involved in, which had a joint venture with a Chinese company who decided actually it would be better to build a coal-fired one right next door. So they're now producing vast quantities of fuel ash, pulverized fuel ash, which we are now experimenting with to mix with our cements to put into concrete, at least starting in the foundations, because it's something new in Pakistan that people are unsure of. And yes, it's quite a risk to tell somebody to do something if it falls apart or cracks or whatever. So I was a bit surprised to see those two products on the please do not use list. Otherwise, they just sit in big piles, mountains. So why is that, Rob? Why are they being discouraged from being used? From being produced, I can understand, but why stop them being used when they're a cement replacement?
No, I think that's a very good point. It's the production of them that is causing the problem.
Yeah. So yes, Stephen, I think you're right. If you can find out whatever country we're doing tanks and all, and if there are other products that can be mixed with cement to reduce the amount of cement that's used, that is a big benefit environmentally. There are disadvantages with these things, but it wouldn't matter for civils works. Generally, PFA replacement, GGBS, this rate of gain of strength to get to your 35 newtons is much, much slower, but it does carry on longer. So when you're doing multi-story buildings, it's not so clever, because you can't wait around longer when you're trying to get each floor up and the columns below strong enough to carry what you're going to carry above if they haven't reached the strength yet. So.
Now, I was very conscious when I was talking about concrete and cement that I was treading on things that I didn't really know much about. So I'm very glad that you put me right.
I was wanted to just ask if another question, if I may, about whether people have looked into carbon offsetting. I know you'd mentioned it, Rob, in passing, but the way I was thinking about it was there's obviously a lot of people offset their socially conscious people offset their carbon footprint, flights or whatever, by personally paying some money into a scheme that puts money into an overseas project, mostly tree planting, or sometimes hydro schemes or water schemes in developing countries. And that's true too of companies in their social responsibility role. So I don't know, my feeling is there must be a lot of money in this market, this offset market, looking for projects, really. And I wondered whether there's ways we could tap into that finance, really, to say that we've got a hydro scheme coming up in Uganda. And actually, I went on to one of these companies called My Climate, and they do these schemes. And there was a hydro scheme and a water scheme in Uganda, very close to where we are actually proposing another hydro scheme. So I just thought, is this a way we could get money to finance schemes, really? I just wondered if anyone had looked at that.
No, it's an interesting idea. I haven't thought about that.
I think from when I looked at it, I did make a preliminary inquiry, and it appears that the one, at least in My Climate, you have to go through quite a rigorous development of the project from an early conceptual stage, and they do sort of third-party authentication of the fact that it's actually giving you these offsets. And I think that you don't get the money until the whole scheme's completed and it's actually delivering the offsets, I think. That was my feeling. So it may be that the way you structure your project development and design, it may affect that. But that's just a preliminary look at just one company that I had a look at. But I don't know if anyone else has looked at that at all.
We did have a discussion with the person who heads up Climate Stewards when we first started thinking about a CED's climate policy. So they are very rigorous in the way they assess the projects to make sure that there is real savings going on in any projects that they look at. But then that makes the carbon offsetting more expensive because you're having to fund that. Yes, so we've looked at it from that point of view, but we haven't looked at it from the view of trying to win funds from these places or trying to be a sponsored project. That's yes. By all means, carry on looking into that, Nigel. That'd be an interesting.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking about it. I talked it over with Jonathan Appleby as to whether we might be to use it for the Uganda water project, the remaining bits of it. But it may be that it's too late because we've already started, the project's underway, and I'm not sure whether you could come in halfway through. And,
right.
Yes. Maybe you've got to do it from ground zero along, So and I will do more investigation anyway. Feedback.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, again on that, it won't surprise you that all these conversations are going on at Tier Fund. The carbon offsetting one, there's a general feeling that it's kind of, a lot of it is kind of avoiding the difficulty of doing the reduction in the first place. So we're trying, although we do carbon offset and we are going to carry on, we're still focusing on actual reduction where possible. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you how complex that can get in our context. The question of could we be recipients of such funds has also been raised. One of them was, could we use our own projects as offsets? But again, as been mentioned, there's a number of rules, particularly if you want to hit the gold standard of this. You're not supposed to You're not supposed to claim an offset for something that you would have done anyway. So if you were going to run a project, you can't say, oh yes, well, this is now our offset. And the authentication is particularly stringent, and over a long period of time, if you're going to justify that it does in fact produce the offset. You know, if you're growing trees or something, then they're supposed to be monitored for 10 years, something like that. So yes, it does get very complex, and as far as I'm aware, we are not pursuing that at the moment ourselves. That could change, of course.
Thank you. It's interesting.
Did you sorry, just on that, Steve, did you actually contact any offset companies or anything to get an idea as to whether some are better than others, some are easier to get funding from than others, etc.?
I didn't. Colleagues of mine, I believe, I mean, they've been in contact with climate stewards and others. I don't know what the conversations
Right,
you know, have involved. It wouldn't surprise me though, because obviously we're exploring all sorts of things.
yeah.
Because part of our problem, if you like, is that we are advocating for governments, particularly in the West, to commit to very, very high reductions, and we have a walk the talk responsibility. And you know, if we're saying to the government, you should reduce emissions by 78%, I think is one of the numbers, it looks very disingenuous if we ourselves are saying, but we won't bother. So you know, we have that particular challenge. So any number of different things are being considered, and you know, this is partly, not entirely, but partly where this South Sudan solar has come from.
Right. I mean, nevertheless, despite all those problems of trying to, it may be that you do have a very genuine project that is actually going to really offset carbon. And why shouldn't that be valid for that type of funding? Really, if there's a way of showing it.
Sorry, if that's what me, then yes, but I'm in no position to you know, to really give any information.
Thank you.
I'm getting the impression that there is a lot of sympathy for thinking about these issues amongst the group that we have here assembled. I'm wondering whether we have effectively selected sympathetic people to come and listen to this subject, and that the people who might be less sympathetic are not here.
I think you have a point there, Rob, yes. Well, if nobody else has any other comments, we will draw this to a close.
Oh, I put my hand up.
Oh, yes, sorry, I missed that.
There was a yellow hand, yes.
Yeah.
A yellow hand, actually. I was interested, thank you, Rob, for your talk. That was really good. I was interested in your comment about needing to build the capacity of partners in order to be able to, you know, connect through Zoom and, you know, on the internet. And I worked for CMS. I just retired, but we were constantly thinking, how do we have meetings with partners like in Congo when they have very poor internet? So we provided them all. We had a consultation recently along Eastern Congo, and we had to provide every single place 6 dioceses with internet capacity to connect by internet. So sending in routers and all of that. And I was just thinking, yes, is there a way in which CED changes the way it connects with partners, recognizing that in Africa and Asia too, if you really want to have a good connection with people, you need to meet them and drink tea together. But yeah, I'm interested. I was interested in your comment, and I wonder what that might mean for CED in the way they connect with partners rather than flying there or whatever you might do in normal circumstances. Because the pandemic taught us a new way of living, of doing, didn't it?
I think that there is one project in which I think Jonathan Appleby said that they are now having weekly Zoom meetings with overseas partners, which is an interesting development.
Well, at CMS, we were doing that. We were conducting our meetings by Zoom weekly with our partners in Kenya. And before, we would have gone there 3 or 4 times a year to do the same.
It doesn't mean you have to do only one way and not the other way. You can actually have a mix of both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alan is raising his hand, Barbara.
Alan's wanted to say something.
You're muted. Yeah. Alan, you're muted.
Yeah, we can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, just for individuals, because we haven't really come to what us as members do. Is there a recommended organisation for offsetting?
Rob, do you have a view on that?
I think you know the answer to that, don't you? Isn't it? Is it climate stewards or?
They're the only people that we've spoken to.
Yeah.
So it is a Christian organisation, and it's, as far as I know, it's a good one. But I can't say I've really looked into it to compare with others.
Well, that's a good start.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Again, do look at their website, see what you think.
Yeah, it's a subject I haven't researched.
Rob, you mentioned Eco Church, actually, that you said that your church hadn't quite decided
That's right.
whether to do it. We have got a group, a climate care group, which is meeting for our church, and we have achieved a bronze award. So it's, you get bronze, silver and gold awards, which is really just a bit of encouragement, really. And to get to a bronze is not tremendously onerous, and it's worth trying to see. You get the enthusiasm behind, that objective. And then I think as you go to silver and gold, I think there's only about 32 churches in the country that have achieved a gold award so far. I think Salisbury Cathedral has, and they have things like nesting of peregrine falcons and things in the grass of the church. So it's worth really trying to get something like that going, because the church really needs to carry this forward, possible.
I think our church is a bit worried about being known as an eco church. They actually are discussing some of the issues behind the scenes anyway. And they've started thinking about insulation and things like that.
Okay, yeah.
So why are they worried, Rob? Do you know?
Well, they want to be known as a Bible teaching church, not as an eco church.
They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, they're not.
Hi, Steve, you said in the chat, I have high hopes for Starlink. Would you like to expand on that?
I could talk at length about Starlink. I don't know how many of you know, but this is a satellite internet service launched by Elon Musk and his SpaceX. And unlike most satellite internet services, which are geostationary, so they're 36,000 kilometers away, so there's a huge latency, big delay in the signal, which you notice when you're on a call like this. We have a number of these, particularly in South Sudan. Starlink is low Earth orbit. It's a whole series of satellites. I think there are about 2,000 at the moment. and so the latency is much slower, much smaller. Sorry, down to tens of milliseconds, and the throughput speed. Again, I mean, in South Sudan and alike, we are paying thousands of dollars a month for a few megabits per second of data. Starlink is $500 for the equipment and $99 a month for hundreds of megabits. And it's virtually sort of user setupable. There is a box arrives. I talk about this. I haven't seen any. It's just, you know, it's been launched in a lot of countries. None of them yet quite any of the countries that we want to use it in. But this box appears. It has a dish. You connect the stand. The wires are plugged up to the router, and there's three bits or whatever. You put it out. You put it somewhere where it has a very, very good and wide view of the sky. You plug it in. You turn it on, and a few minutes later, you have you know, hundreds of megabits of internet. It's been in the news recently because Elon Musk has sent a whole bunch of these to Ukraine, and has a few weeks ago also put some in Tonga, where where was it, an underwater volcano or something, and it's gradually spreading across the world. It's in I can't remember how many countries now. It started in the US, Canada, the UK, a number of European countries. It's on the cusp of going live in Brazil, and I'm very optimistic because the first African country I think it's going to be in Mozambique looks like it's going to happen, but it's been delayed longer than the original timescale was. We've signed up about 30 different locations so that we were on the list, the first come first served, as it was described, list, and we're still waiting. So, but I think it's one of those things that could be a massive game changer, because the difference between what people are getting now and what they're paying for compared to what this is potentially is just enormous. And I have high hopes that, you know, you put one of these in a village somewhere in the middle of Africa, and suddenly there's all sorts of things you can do that just weren't possible before. And although it's comparatively expensive, you know, compared to incomes and things, compared to what else is available, the speed come cost ratio is just, it's like nothing else really. Even the spread of 4G, which is enabling all sorts of things across the world, I don't think will be quite the same as this in those remoter parts of the world. So yeah, starlink.com, but I'm quite sure if you Google Starlink, you'll find all sorts of stuff about it, including a very, very active Reddit group. Which, yeah.
Right. Thank you. Well, a big thank you to Rob for his talk this evening and all the thought that's gone behind it. Thank you everyone for contributing to the discussion. I hope the discussion is not going to end there. You know, if you have other thoughts, do email them into us. We're always interested to know what members and indeed others are thinking and looking for ways to improve what we do. So please let's keep the conversation going.